when I talk to people about your work, I try not to use the word ambient because I think it's a bit reductionist, in particular with an artist like yourself with such a huge catalog. Um, for lack of a better term, I like to call you a minimalist. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, I mean, I always like Charlemagne Palestine's maximal minimalist.
Nice.
I think Charlemagne really nailed that one right on the head, and we can all just kind of ride on his coattails indefinitely.
What does it mean for you?
I mean, look, I think ambient as actually just to take one step back, I think ambient's a really interesting term, um, because I think it travels in parallel maybe with a kind of historical reading, which is always going to be tethered to that period in the 70s and those records that made only because they when you start searching, that's where you start from in a lot of respects. But I think the ideas of ambient works stretch back further. Um, and for me, what I what I like about the term is the porousness, actually. And for me, I don't draw a distinction between, like I like to think of everything as a kind of dialect of sound. So the idea of what people might call noise music and ambient are very much travel in parallel to me because you're kind of working with the same sorts of gestures, maybe executed differently, but there is a kind of interest in texture and in kind of timbral quality. There's an interest in pulse, I would say, in opposition to rhythm, and harmony in opposition to melody in some cases. I mean, there is definitely obviously melodious ambient work, but I think there's a tendency to move towards those orbits, and I think that's why I'm still very open to the term ambient as an idea because I think it is, to its own success or failure. Maybe it's ill-defined, and we can rewrite part of that definition.
As all great art is, right?
Ideally, yeah. I mean, I understand the role of heritage arts. Like to this idea that something becomes fixed in a time and a place, and I think that's actually okay. And I
Mm.
think we can celebrate those times and places, like the political and social conditions that allow something to persist in a moment and not persist in another moment. It's actually really important to recognize those things and understand uh, the circumstances that allow work to come into existence and maybe to proliferate or not. And for me, I'm always interested in everything else that sits around that conversation of music because this idea that somehow music is just it's something coming down an antenna somewhere that is completely without context, I think is such a sort of shallow reading of what the work actually is about. And ideally, once you start to kind of place it into a bigger sociocultural framework, you start to recognize all of the stuff that, like, that's where this ideas of community comes from. It's the whole questions around a sort of solidarity and sound that can come into the fray.
It has long seemed to me that the music that we're talking about, yours and of course others, is reflective of something important in our world. I'm not quite sure if it's a reaction to something or if it's an expression of something. I'm curious how you see your own music and how it exists in today's world and why it resonates with people so much.
I mean, look, I'm really happy if it does resonate with people, but that's the first thing to say. It's an interesting question. I mean, I can say categorically, I'm not a person that makes work from nothing. Like, I work best, and in fact, I only really work when I'm in some kind of bind or in a frame or constricted somehow. The tighter the binds, the more interesting I think the work becomes for me. Other people, and what I love about real musicians, like people that you can give them a glass bottle and a fork, and they can make you this, beautiful little sort of rhythmic melody. And I have friends like that. That I think Tennis Coats, this Japanese group who I've worked with for a long time. When I sit down with Saya and Ueno, they are truly musicians. They have this way with each other and with sound and with harmony and melody that is just something I will never get close to. And I am fascinated by that. I'm fascinated by people that can do that. It's not my mode of operation at all. So for me, I almost all the work is coming from a place of concept or interest that is bigger than the work itself, and I find that personally more satisfying. So this last decade, the work like Wilderness of Mirrors and Cruel Optimism, I mean, they're very much rooted in, a kind of, I think, a shared frustration we all have with the state of geopolitics and the kind of ground level execution of what some of that stuff means. And also maybe the frustration that a lot of us feel with a kind of lack of agency or power to be able to influence any of that stuff, that we have these proposed systems that are meant to kind of manage and direct how it is we feel that society might want to travel, and yet it's very difficult to kind of see any actualization of that. So I mean, those records are kind of like, I don't want to say protest records because they're not really protest records, but they share that kind of energy of being vocal, of being frustrated, of being in a state of desire for something more than what is there. And that's kind of emblematic of a lot of the records. They each kind of rest in different places, whether it be a kind of more thematic rest, like the Approach record that I made a couple of years ago. I mean, that was very much responding to a very personal story in a lot of ways, but also something that, now we see as the common everyday, like this idea of manga and anime being on, having dedicated streaming channels. I mean, that is so foreign to what I came into as a sort of preteen, where there was like 5 titles at a comic shop that you could go and read. And the kind of, even something as simple as like the way that you navigate and search that becomes really telling, I think, about the changes and the opportunities and the costs maybe of those shifts in time in terms of your ability to access cultural artifacts. Look, infallibility is boring, really boring. Like the idea that somehow there is a right and a wrong position and you have to kind of align with one or the other is just so dramatically tedious. Because we know that is not the case, that there is, like, I mean, obviously there are truths and there are facts, but the way that those things are framed up and discussed are not fixed, and they're constantly shifting, and there can be two true. I mean, yesterday I learned that aluminum and aluminium are both correct. It's amazing to think about that history of life. And it's interesting too, because for us, we say aluminium, which is, of course, the Royal Society's version of that term. And we refuse the individual, whereas in North America, you say aluminum, which was Davy's term for the thing. It's amazing, all of these little histories, and they're both true and they're both correct, but they speak to a different kind of reading of that circumstance. And I'm always interested in that. And I think when it comes to the idea of making work, I think certainly for us being more mature individuals, we remember that time where there was this aspiration or promise of something like a CD being a truthful rendering. It was, again, this return to the very early 20th century's idea of what field recording was, this kind of capture of truth or capture of reality, a sort of objective read of things. Of course, it was never going to be that. And there are still failings that were there. And those failings became obviously a center point during that late 90s, early 2000s period with kind of glitch and all of that kind of thing. So we started to recognize the failings of that technology as it had aged a little bit, I guess, and some of the CD players broke down a touch, and then you've got Yes Now Tony making amazing work from that. But yeah, for me, I think it's part of the pleasure is maybe testing these ideas, and these, in the case of music, testing where the failure points are, and recognizing that actually in failure is success always. It's just whether or not you're able to be porous enough to kind of let that in.
One of my favorite memories in my early days in radio was right around the time you're describing. And I was with a friend who was on air, and the CD he was playing started to skip. And he left it, he let it play. And he looked at me and he said, "It's so much more interesting than when vinyl malfunctions." And it was this sort of aha moment for me, like that there was something extraordinarily musical about this
I guess that's
CD.
it's the intergenerational question, isn't it, between Christian Marclay and Oval? You know, which school are you with?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that was life changing for me, and it completely by happenstance. You must have experienced all kinds of those sort of beautiful mistakes over the years.
Yeah, I mean, most of my work is mistakes, I think, in some way, shape, or form, and I'm absolutely good to embrace those. I mean, particularly early on. I can tell you the first time I ever played a concert overseas. This is in 2001, 2. I think the end of 2002. I went on this kind of strange sort of micro tour. Um, I went to Tokyo. Was the first show I ever played was in Tokyo, and I went. I developed at this point. I was really working with these kind of improvisational strategies, I guess you'd say, like setting up a system that could, well, actually, that could fail, and then working with that. And I'd made this sort of self-oscillating feedback loop in this power book that I had, you know, the kind of old Wall Street, the black power book, which I still have a weird respect for as an object. And here we have, you know, we run on 240 volts and we run on 60 cycles. And of course, in Japan, they run on 110 volts and 50 cycles. So I went there prepared to make a piece that was based around this, essentially around this power cycling. I got there and set up, and then I realized, of course, completely different and completely not what I was planning to do for this show. So I had to kind of basically fail, colossally fail for 15 or 20 minutes or however long it was. But in that process, you start to recognize that actually the circumstances are different and the net material result is different, but the kind of procedural and the process reveals something else about that, and you begin to work with it as a kind of as a failing. And that was really, I mean, as a way to start performance internationally was the best way to start, because after that, anything that you do is a triple plus. I mean, I've had plenty of other shows since then where, you know, I've knocked laptops off the tables, and I've actually broke one of my laptops at a show once, which was not intentional. It was just, I used to have a harmonium and that rocked a lot while you played it. And I generally rock the gear off the table because I'd be in the moment, so to speak. And yeah, I mean, it added a little expensive punk rock, I suppose you could say.
So there you are. It's your first show away from home. You know it's going to be something unorthodox, but it turns out to be more problematic than you thought. What's that feel like?
I mean, I'm not exactly you know, like everyone, I feel anxiety from time to time, but I'm not exactly an anxious person. I try and see things as, you know, almost everything is a gift. I say that quite a bit, and I do, for the most part, believe that. I mean, there are certainly things that aren't gifts in life, but I try and look at most things as a gift. So for me, in that moment, and this show was at offside. So at that point, I was very into the kind of Onkyo movement. So it was people like Otomo Yoshihide and Sachiko M, Take Sugimoto, Tetsuya Akiyama, Toshimaru Nakamura. It was like it was because this Bonakai, which is a kind of end of year party celebrating the year passing. So everyone was there doing these very short performances, and it was like incredible, like to sit there and to be able to hear this work that I'd mostly heard on record, which of course performatively is completely different because the room plays such a huge role in it. And also, I can say this without any question, you know, to feel the generosity of those people, particularly Ottoman at that point, who recognized I was clearly a fish out of water, and very generously made me feel incredibly welcome, which to this day I hold as a benchmark of how to make people feel when they arrive at things, because I do a lot of organizing. That's a huge thing to feel comfortable. So I'm not sure if I've really answered the question, but that's maybe how I felt in those moments.
Well, beyond the anxiety of it, there's two things that strike me. There's a sense of courage, which I think your practice clearly states. You are a very courageous artist, but also openness. I was watching the video you have posted to your website, Listening as a Practice. And that was kind of a theme for me as I listened to you talk about field recordings and other things that we listen to, choose choose not to listen to. And I thought to myself, you have come to a point in your life where you are very open to sound and what constitutes music. And I'm curious how you got there. What led you to that? And was it at any point ever difficult?
It's a good question, because I think the thing is, there's probably lots of things that lead people through their lives, and a lot of them are potentially not to do with the subject that you're actually addressing. So, I mean, I tell this story a lot about wanting, discovering my ears with my father when I was bird watching as a kid. And I mean, that certainly is one of those moments that at the time probably did not mean so much, and I didn't necessarily think about it. But the further away from that moment, I guess, I come to, the more I recognize that those tiny little things become these enormous opportunities if you are available to them. It's always about being present and available to something. That's what listening as a practice is. You've got to be there, and if you're not there, then you don't get it again, because the sound never repeats that way. I mean, you might hear a variation of it, but that moment in that place in that time, it's only then that you can have that. And I mean, it's really simple now. Like, anyone sitting down listening to this, or watching the video, like, there are sounds happening around them right now. And if they think about it again in 5 minutes time, okay, they're in the same place in a similar time, but the sound will be different. And the nuance of that is part of the pleasure, I think, of listening as a practice. So for me, this idea of kind of coming along through sound, I mean, I think there have been certain things that really, opened me up. I can say without a doubt, hearing a Kiss record when I was 10 probably was part of that. And discovering Merzbow like 5 or 6 years later. Listening to, I had a great tape. One side was the Violent Femmes' first record, and the other side was Public Enemy's Fear of a Black Planet, 2 records I still really love. And I mean, those moments when you're like 12, 13, 14 are hugely affecting, even if you don't recognize that impact in those moments. But then as you move along, you hear other music that again makes you feel that sense of like, I've never heard anything like this, which is, I think for me, Fear of Black Planet was one of those records. When I heard it, I was like, how do you even make that thing? Like, there's voices, and there's sounds like things from movies, and then there's these people kind of delivering this incredible dialogue over the top of it all. It was just, and it was also the skit based thing, and the fact that it all linked together. That was just like, it's like a film in sound. And I found that the same kind of moments where, like the first time I heard Free Jazz, that on a Common record, you just listen to it, you think, like, oh my God, like someone actually devised this or they arrived at this somehow. And it's the same for hearing Pulse Demon, like you just were like, how does that even get made? And that's what I still love. It doesn't happen all the time anymore, but occasionally you'll hear things. Like, I went back to listen to some Terry Riley recently, And I put that on, I was like, how did he even make this? You know, it's so impossibly simple and impossibly complex all at once, you know. And I love that. Um, I love the not knowing. And that's maybe what I've actually really enjoyed about field recording. The kind of field recording work that I enjoy listening to, like some of those early Chris Watson records and Yana Windrum, the same, you know, you put them on and you're like, what, where even, this isn't on Earth. You know, this is some other place that I can't possibly imagine. And even now going out and I just was able to go and record in some sort of sites of heavy industry about 7 hours north of here. And going there, again, it was like this idea that you were hearing something that wasn't really of Earth. You know, there was this kind of like, it was very mechanical in this sense, but just extraordinary. And it was just about being available to it. Some people would probably perceive it just as noise, but for me, it was, oh, you know, noise isn't something that's like to be filtered out. But I think if you lean into that, then there is this wonderful opening up that's pretty much perpetual.
But surely there must be noise that annoys you. There must be sound that just
Well, it's
doesn't.
a good question, actually, because I strangely this week I did a radio interview here that was about this idea of noise, and a lot of the discussion, or some of the discussion, was around, you know, how we define that term. I mean, for me, noise is it's one of these points of reference. It's this thing that's not ill-defined, and it's so situational and so context driven. And someone rang in on this program, was like, you know, I was at a train station and there was all this stuff going on and it was really overwhelming and I was very stressed after work. And then this person said, you know, but I've been practicing mindfulness, which is not something I necessarily practice in any kind of meaningful way, but I was able to hear this person describe how they tuned into the sounds and started to kind of like navigate this, what was a noise field, I suppose, for them, and make sense out of that and become present in that moment and find something that was strangely in excess of the noise. And I think that's part of the challenge and the pleasure with something like noise, is recognizing the everything is bounded, even noise. I mean, white noise is this beautiful idea of being kind of infinite in terms of its scope and possibility, you know, that it extends in all directions. But again, our subjective read of it is still very limited. And I like that, not, I think failing's the wrong word. I like that limitation of humanity, that of, and of our subjective state of approaching this stuff. And that for me, I think, is actually, it's what drives my interest in it perpetually, because I recognize that the edge of, you know, what Don Eder probably would have called the horizon of audition, and I'm using this in quite a lateral way here, but like the horizon of audition is always shifting, and your capacity to engage with it is shifting at the same time. And there's this beautiful sort of, sometimes tidal, sometimes just more dynamic kind of engagement in the practice of listening, of making, of all of those things all tied up together.
Speaking of limitations, so many of us reach a certain point in our lives where we stop listening to new music. That's clearly not happened to you. Why do you think?
Thank you, COVID. COVID was my great listening period. So I'm going to look back to it in 25 years' time, be praying for another pandemic.
It's such a common thing, though, right? And studies have been done about why it is people become so focused on the music of their youth. Why didn't it happen to you?
I mean, I can still appreciate the music of my youth in a way. It's a very different, I can feel it physiologically, you know, at an affective level. It's a different experience sometimes. And I can tolerate things, strangely. I can tolerate music from that, from certain times more than others, because of the historical affective relations that I've maintained with that work. You know, when things arrive in your life, and I think that's the thing, I often try and make sense of how it was that I navigated, you know, from age 10 to age 21. Like everything seems to happen all at once during that time. Like I was, I was listening to this, the mixtape's a great example. I've got Violent Femmes on one side and Public Enemy on the other. I mean, that doesn't really make sense. At the same time, I was clearly listening to, a lot of weird. I was really into like underground glam and death metal from Los Angeles. Like I was tape trading during that time. It was all over the place, but it was all coexisting together, and it made sense for me. Like I'm sure it was maybe a rolling series of obsessions or something during that time, but I am fascinated by how porous we are at certain periods in our lives. And I think as we get older, I understand like time becomes differently precious, I guess, and your maybe your capacity to engage socially with work becomes different. Like I think there's a time in your teenage years where everyone's probably pushing at the boundaries, so there's a kind of collective reaching out that happens. And then as you get older, things become more fixed, or there's a different kind of social sanctioning that comes in to things. I was very comfortable not being not participating in socially sanctioned activities or ways of being when I was a teenager, and that cost me in certain ways. Like I'm the very fortunate outcome of a kind of difficult teenage period of being at like an all boys Catholic school. I know for other people, it's not, they didn't have a positive experience under the kind of duress and pressure that was there. But for me, it kind of, and I feel anyway, it made me who I am. And it made me more resolved to work against the things that I was not interested in being part of. But yeah, I mean, for me personally, why am I still interested in new work? I love ideas and I love being surprised. And I think that the stuff that sits around music that we spoke about before impacts so heavily on how people make it. I think the precarity of the last sort of 15 years has bred some really incredible work, and work that is delivered in ways that add a certain pressure or intensity to the listening experience, because the challenges that people are facing to make the work, and I feel you have to respect those challenges as part of the process of listening to that work and respect the work accordingly. For me, I mean, it's not, I try and listen to a lot of work. It is difficult. I certainly struggle. I mean, it's just the nature of the label alone. There'll be some days where, I mean, a normal days where we're getting between 8 and 11 demos a day. Busy days, sometimes you get 25 or 30. It's really a lot of work to listen to. And I mean, you would know this as well, like the amount of music that is being released, not just kind of proposed, is enormous. It's kind of incalculable somehow. We just can't make sense of it. So I know I miss out on lots, and I'm okay. I don't need to be everywhere. But what I do need to do is try and like situate myself in work that is meaningful for me. And I don't necessarily know where that meaning is going to come from. So I need to be porous and agile enough to just move between those things. I will say during the COVID years, I listened to the most music I've listened to in more than a decade, easily. It was, though I can say it in all honesty, I loved Bandcamp Friday as a concept. I love this sort of idea of supporting people, but I also love the fact that everyone was putting tons of stuff out. And I was able to have the time to really appreciate that work, because I wasn't on tour. I wasn't, delivering events. I wasn't like whatever else I do. And that was such a magical time. I will look back on those years personally as an absolute godsend, like the best gift I could have possibly asked for.
Yeah, the work was genuinely therapeutic, wasn't it?
It was. I mean, like COVID itself, total pain in the ass. Definitely have not. I mean, I would argue my brain has not been the same since I've had that. But everything else that's sat around that, fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Like, and I secretly hoped that more people would. And I mean, I think there is a kind of incremental shift now, but I had hoped people would recognize that there's this whole, like, what it showed was there was this it presented the doorway, and you could look into the door and see this other thing that you could do with your life, like the way that you could operate your life and the other things that can occupy your time and interest, and other ways you can work, all of those things all happening in there. And I do hope that some of those opportunities are actualized more solidly in the next decade or two, because we need a change. What's going on is definitely not working for most people. And yeah, if it takes a pandemic or two to make us change, then that's maybe a net gain at the end.
On another topic, I was pleased to see you part of that new tribute to Ryuichi Sakamoto
Mm.
music. Tell me about your relationship with him, why he was such a meaningful figure to so many of us.
Well, being called Lawrence, he's recurred throughout my life in many different ways. There's been many a pun at the gesture of Sakamoto's work. I mean, look, I only met Sakamoto a few times. I will say, in my encounters with him, I found him to be incredibly genuine, and incredibly generous. Kind of disarmingly so, I would say. In the first time that I met him in New York, I was really surprised by how engaged and interested he was in my work, and I was, principally there to kind of organize a project for him. And I found that uh, generosity and curiosity that he maintained really, I guess, emblematic of what I hope that, what we should all aspire to. And I find this in other people too, like someone like Mike Cooper, who's turning 81 shortly. That guy is still fascinated with music. He's still fascinated with new music. He is constantly consuming things. He's always feeding me links to things I've never heard of, from current things and also historical things. And I look at that and think that's the engagement I want to have in the world. It's the same for people like David Tupor and Neil Lockwood. You talk to these folks. Phil Niblock's a great example. I mean, the guy's turning 90 this year. Still going, still thinking about ideas, still completely engaged. And Sakamoto had that quality of being like really curious, really, obviously a very driven person, and a very skilled, obviously very skilled composer, but also very skilled at recognizing how things can fit together. I think he was very good at that. And that maybe comes from his production side, but he was just so available to the work and to the practice, and so he obviously took it very seriously, but also just let it breathe. And I think that's a huge part of it too. So for me, I have a great deal of respect, not just for the work, but also for his way of navigating through that, and through tracing what is a really divergent life in music, and having it make sense, that things that seem unrelated have threads that tie them together, and that sometimes you decide to add more to a thread, and it becomes like a piece of rope, and that's the thing you use to pull other parts through, or pull other people through sometimes. And I think he was very good at doing that. I can say genuinely, I'm disappointed I didn't get to. We were talking about developing a couple of projects. I was very interested in supporting. He's made some fantastic kind of operatic work. I really wanted to support that through my kind of life as a curator. I'm disappointed that won't be actualized, because I think he's the great shame when anyone like that passes is that you recognize that there was a whole other body of work still to come. And he was definitely, that last recording, I think, really captured a perspective in both directions, which I think is really beautiful. But you knew there was so much more there to kind of be uncovered. And that's a shame. It's also beautiful in a way that we can't have everything that we desire. But yeah, I am genuinely sad that we don't get to experience what would come in that later period of his kind of compositional life.
He performed a solo piano concert here a few years back, and there was so much reverence in the room for him that he had completed 3 pieces before anybody applauded. It's this sense that we couldn't possibly interrupt him. It was palpable. I'd never seen anything like it. And he was very gracious about it. He didn't make anything of it at all, but it was both funny, but also just so, for me, indicative of how people felt about him and thought about him. And yeah, I think his passing is just the saddest music story I've heard in I don't know how long.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame. There's no doubt. I mean, I think as you get to certain points in your life, some of the people that you've been in contact with do disappear. And I can see that very clearly in front of me. Some of the people that I really care for musically, but also personally, I recognize that their time is finite. And I often, I go back to thinking quite often thinking about Tony Conrad, for example, one of these figures that, again, I'm disappointed I did not get to spend. The time I spent with him was amazing, but I'm disappointed I just didn't get to spend more time with him, because they are huge repositories of, if nothing else, fantastic stories. They existed in a place and a time that we can never know, and the only way we can kind of get any inkling of that is through those stories. And the kind of social history function that I think plays such a huge role in music is something we need to celebrate. I've certainly tried to do that. I will say, in this last few years, these kind of book editions that we're doing on Room 40. So we did one with David Toop, and there's a new one coming with Anea Lockwood. There was one with Faust, doing a kind of social history of their work, the kind of Swedish post-industrial group. That my feeling is partly to collect together people talking about their stories and their ways and the experiences they had, the reasons that they made things. Because otherwise, quite often, like, even if you go looking for old interviews on the web, they're actually really hard to come by. A lot of them just vanish. And there's this kind of gap that exists there that we need to address. Because if we don't capture it, that's it, it's gone. So, and it's not really capture if we don't kind of give an opportunity for the stories to be told. They won't be.
Another artist I wanted to ask you about is Peter Rayberg of Editions Mago. Earlier this year, I had a chat with Cinder, and we talked about Peter's extraordinary effect on the careers of so many artists. And Cinder talked about how struck they were by Peter's balance between the label and his solo music. Has that been a challenge for you with Room 40 and your solo career?
I mean, it's dynamic, that's for sure. I mean, look, I don't know if this is necessarily the best example, but there was a 6-year gap between Cruel Optimism and Approach. And I didn't quite realize it was that long, but it was. I mean, I haven't really played a solo electronic show since 2018. It's a very long time since I've toured solo. I mean, I've done some diffusions and some organ concerts and stuff, but I haven't played like a kind of solo electronics show since 2018. And I'm having a big think about what role that plays going forward, for sure, in my life. I am going to do a tour with Lossell in October this year, which I'm really looking forward to. I love Scott. I think he's an incredibly beautiful, intelligent, and talented human being. But this is the first tour in a long time, and we've got another one in February as well in Europe. But I'm giving that serious thought. Like, what's our relationship to those things going forward? I think is always something we need to be conscious of somehow.
Well, please keep making music.
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of the idea of the label and making work, there is definitely, I mean, it's obviously it's a question of time. And I have obviously, I mean, we did 140 releases in 2 years during COVID, which is a lot of work. At the end of 2020 was the 20th anniversary of the label. Not that I really kind of made any point about that. It wasn't really the time to do it. I've never felt more satisfied doing the label. Never. Like the most satisfied, the most excited, the most ideas for how things might develop and grow. And I have tried to maintain that energy going forward. It is increasingly difficult because now there are other things that demand time. This year I've done a lot of curation for festivals and programs and exhibitions. They all take a lot of time, and I think they're all incredibly valuable undertakings, but they do mean that it's harder to have the opportunity to spend as long working on the label, and in turn working on my own material. I've been really fortunate to have some great kind of collaboratorial projects over the last few years that are still kind of, there's a couple more of those to come in the next little while. But yes, solo work, I mean, strangely, I spent the last 2 nights building these kind of, I mean, they're modular units, but making kind of like processing instruments, I guess, that I'm going to start hopefully working on. I mean, I have made a lot of sound, but it's been very directed towards like either theatre work or performative projects. And the other side of my practice as a, what I guess some people would describe as fine arts, I mean, that's also been very busy. I mean, I'm in the process of just discovered that I have an opportunity to found a bell. So I'm going to actually make a like 800 kilo bell that will extend far beyond my life on this planet and could be here in several millennia. And I like that idea that, the resonance of the object can maintain much longer than the failing of the subjective body. So we'll see. That I'll be bringing it next March, all things going to plan. So we'll see.
Well, that is as good an endpoint as I can imagine, Maurice. Thanks for this.
Totally my pleasure. Thank you for chatting.